If one supper could change your fate forever, would you help the people who held power over you, or would you walk into the night and not look back? Be honest, what would you do? Tell me in the comments. The crystal light on the long table looked like stars caught in glass. 12 chairs, polished silver, a clock that counted the seconds like a drum. Outside, warm air moved through magnolia trees. Inside, a family lifted their glasses, laughing the way people do when they feel unshakable. The house had spent all day rehearsing joy. By morning, it would be quiet. Clara stood where kitchens meet parlors, the thin line between heat and ceremony. She knew every creak in the floors, every draft that crossed the hall, every shadow that slid across the portrait frames at dusk. 11 years had made her invisible, and because of that, impossible to ignore. She had a cook's hands, a listener's patience, and eyes that saw more than anyone guessed. They called it a birthday supper. A few cousins had arrived early. Children chased their reflections in the glass of a cabinet door. Margaret Whitmore smoothed the cloth and said grace in a voice trained for company. The first bite was praise. The second bite was conversation. The third was habit. No one noticed the small flinch in Clara's fingers, the way she pressed her palm flat to the doorframe, steadying herself like a pianist before a hard passage. According to a page once kept by a local physician, the family began to feel unwell almost at the same time. According to other voices, the room simply changed. Laughter thinned, toasts trailed off, the clock got loud. What happened next would divide the county for years. Some called it justice whispered through a dining room. Others called it a tragedy no one could undo. The only certain thing is this: by the end of the night, 12 chairs sat empty. Who was Clara before that night? A woman who had learned to make a house run so smoothly, the masters believed it ran itself. A woman who had held 2 daughters until the day a ledger said otherwise. Paper had more power than her arms, and the river carried her girls north or south. No one told her which. What she could not hold, she did not forget. She read the world the way some read scripture, line by line, sign by sign, waiting for a path to appear. She found teachers in unusual places: a traveling preacher who loved words more than tithes, a neighbor in the quarters who kept a hymn book hidden inside a flour sack, a peddler who traded pins for proverbs and once left a scrap of a map folded like a bird. With patience and quiet daring, she learned to sound out letters at the edge of candles. She learned how names were written into bills and out of lives. She learned the routes people took when they wanted to change their names back. People will tell you that the dining room turned to panic all at once, that voices rose like a storm, that a bell rang until someone's hand could no longer lift it. People will also tell you that in the kitchen, 6 workers kept washing dishes for a while longer, as if sound alone could not cross a doorway. 2 accounts can be true at the same time. In some houses, survival meant moving slowly when others shouted, and moving quickly when others went silent.
Upstairs, the air held perfume and candle smoke. Downstairs, the air held soap and the breath of many shoulders working close. Through the tall windows, a dark river waited like a door no one had learned to knock on. In the hallway, a young man stood still long enough to remember a day he wished he could change. In the yard, an older man with 3 fingers missing sat on the step and watched the moon cut the clouds into careful pieces. No one spoke first. By dawn, the big house sounded like a church after the last hymn. Cushions held the shape of those who would not return to them. Plates sat where hands had dropped them. The clock was still counting. From the road, a rider came at measured speed. Word had gone out that help was needed. And yet, what help can fix a night that went wrong one quiet minute at a time? There is a river a short walk from that house. The path to it is lined with grass that keeps secrets. If you follow it at night, your feet learn the distance between root and stone, even with your eyes closed. Before anyone knocked at the door, before any official word was written down, there were footprints on that path. Some were familiar. But that wasn't the whole story. The night did not end with empty chairs. It opened another road. Records say the county official arrived mid-morning with a man of medicine who wrote in neat lines and didn't smoke in the house. They took in the quiet and did what people do when they meet something larger than their words. They measured, they asked, they wrote. Their notes spoke of a supper that turned, of symptoms described in cautious phrases, of a household staff who had done their best. The report did not capture the way onion juice can make eyes red without a single tear of grief, or how a hand can tremble from more than fear. Ruth met them first. She had kept keys for 15 years, but never once opened the study door until that morning. In the study, papers waited in careful stacks. She knew which sheets could be burned and which would be needed to prove the house still had an owner. She knew where to find a letter that made something look official and how to tuck it, just so, into a folder no one would think to question. She spoke softly. She repeated the same few lines the same careful way. If you'd been there, you might have believed her. Maybe you still would. Someone asked about Clara. Ruth said what many had agreed to say, that Clara had been transferred earlier in the month with papers to show it. The ink looked right, the signatures looked practiced, the dates aligned. Paper is an actor that never forgets its lines. Paper can also be coached by people who learn very fast and share more loyalty than the world expected from them. The houseworkers cleaned until the rooms shone like silence. The pantry looked normal. The kitchen smelled like soap and wood. If there had been a trace of something bitter, it was gone now, or it had never been there in the first place. The only odd thing a careful eye noted was a single magnolia petal on the floor, as if a breeze had carried it in from the river path. It does not sound like evidence. It sounds like a flower. But some flowers are witnesses.
Outside the big house, the quarters had their own meetings. People spoke without moving their lips. A child climbed into an older woman's lap and fell asleep to the heartbeat that had outlasted too many winters. A blacksmith whispered the kind of plan that always sounds braver in the mouth than on the ground. An elder shook his head before the sentence reached its end. None of them wanted any more loss. All of them understood the risk of telling the wrong truth to the right man. News traveled fast. By noon, kitchens in neighboring homes simmered with unease. Some households put cooking on pause. Some asked a taster to try the first bite, which tells you everything about fear and very little about trust. Down the river, someone folded a bonnet a new way and kept her face turned slightly to the left so a small scar would not catch anyone's eye. A name changed coats. A bundle changed hands. A road changed direction. Clara's path is told in fragments, like a quilt whose pieces were saved from different trunks. A wagoner remembered a quiet passenger who paid on time and said she was visiting cousins. A churchwoman recalled a newcomer with careful manners and a rosary worn shiny from touch. A shopkeeper noticed a handwriting curl on a grocery list, an extra loop at the base of a G that felt like a signature without a name. In another county, a free tradesman said he had seen a woman staring long at a broad river, as if it could answer back.
When officials posted notices, they used words that made crowds look twice. A few men with quick horses treated the search like sport. Others read the news and went home to sit with their wives and ask if their own houses were as solid as they looked. The physician who had written the neat report could not put the story down. He stayed up late tracing routes on maps, wondering why some dots lined up the way they did. He thought about grief as a science. He thought about patience as a plan. He did not write those thoughts in his official notes. In letters never sent, people tried to explain Clara to themselves. Some called her a danger. Some called her a mirror. Some said the night was proof that boundaries had been crossed for too long in one direction and then snapped back with a sound that echoed. Every version of the story revealed more about the teller than it did about Clara. That is often how stories work. And what of the child at the table who said something tasted strange? One version says a little girl named Emma did not wake again. Another version says she slept so deeply the adults believed the worst, then rose before dawn and was carried away by unfamiliar arms who would raise her as if she had been theirs from the start. The truth is something only a few people knew, and most of them learned to keep their mouths shut for the rest of their lives. But that still wasn't the whole story. The river had not yet had its say. On a road that leaned toward the water, a wagon rattled past cane brakes. The driver hummed a tune with no words. The woman beside him watched fences and fields and counted turns under her breath. She wore gloves that once belonged to a different lady. A good disguise is not only cloth, it is posture, pace, the decision to be both seen and unremarked. Her new name felt borrowed, like Sunday shoes that hadn't yet learned her step.
People along the road used to ask strangers 3 questions. Where from, where to, and who belongs to you? The safest answer to all 3 was short. North, church work, cousins. Said with a smile that didn't last long enough to invite more talking. Said with eyes that softened without dropping. Said while counting doors, alleys, and the distance back to the last place she could run if talking turned dangerous. In towns where she paused, she found women who had learned how to welcome and not pry. A seamstress who fixed a tear and slipped a note into the hem. A midwife who pressed bread and a verse into her hands. A preacher who kept his questions for God and his help for people. No one asked for the whole truth. In places like that, the whole truth is too heavy to move quickly. Behind her, the official inquiry widened, not into courts, into conversations, which can be sharper. A county man compared dates and names and noticed how certain families seemed tied together by more than land. The physician, tired and curious, saw a pattern in handwriting, not in faces. The curl in the G turned up in ledgers, kitchen lists, and a transfer record someone had arranged with unusual care. He did not accuse the paper, he simply traced the loop with his finger and felt his heart tap a faster rhythm. There was a man who prided himself on finding people. He looked for the curl too. He walked into a boarding house one rainy morning with 2 others behind him and the kind of impatience that scares furniture. He asked to see hands. He asked to see rooms. He mistook a washerwoman for a witness. He slipped in soapy water and learned that luck chooses its favorites without warning. By the time he wiped his eyes clear, a door swung and a hallway emptied, and the person he wanted most had turned into a moving shadow heading down the steps. Dawn cracked open like an egg above the riverfront. Fog lay low, hugging the waterline. The city smelled like wet rope, coal, and bread starting to bake. A woman ran. Men shouted. A crowd formed the way crowds do, curious first, then pulled tight by the force of someone else's urgency. When the path narrowed toward the water, she slowed. 7 men fanned out, forming a wall that breathed.
People say her voice carried over the river and the shouts and the gulls. They say it was steady. Some claim she argued with them about rights and the shape of the word freedom. Some say she only asked one question and asked it softly. If your children were taken, what would you do? The answer is not in any official record. What is in the record is a blank space where the next line should be. Then a note. Subject lost from view. Did she jump? Did she slip into a skiff? Did someone lift her into a barrel and roll her under the pier? The river keeps secrets for those it favors. Hours later, a farmer downstream swore his boat was missing, and his wife swore her wash line was light by a dress and 2 undershirts. The local man in charge didn't see a connection. The physician saw one, but chose to keep it in his thoughts instead of on paper. Sometimes withholding is not cowardice. Sometimes it is mercy with a cost. The search went on for days. Nets dragged. Banks were walked. A community that knew how to pretend not to see still pretended not to see. Better now than ever. Notices stayed up until the rain turned the ink into gray rivers. People whispered about a letter that never reached Canada. People whispered about a church in Ohio where a woman with careful hands pressed a rosary to her lips and chose a different city before nightfall. People whispered that she was here or there or both, because hope can make one face look like 2 or 10. If she crossed, she would have found a cold that went deeper than water. She would have found streets where her name could change again. She would have found Quaker kitchens with plain bread and plain prayers and a kindness that didn't ask for a receipt. If she didn't cross, she might have circled back through the marshes and waited for the right boat at the wrong hour so no one would think to watch. Either way, the river would be the bridge. But the river is not the end of the story. It is the middle that keeps moving. Back in Natchez, the great house changed hands on paper and in practice. Lawyers said words that turned people into lists. Wagons came, names were called. Goodbyes happened the way they always had, quickly and with eyes that tried not to learn each other's tears. Ruth went east. Samuel went south. Letty stayed for a little while and then didn't. Old Moses laid his hand on the teaching tree, the place where small fingers once traced letters in dust and told it thank you before men with axes turned its lessons into kindling. Even so, lessons have a way of surviving the axe. In kitchens across the county, new rules appeared. 2 people must taste, locks at night, lists signed twice. None of it could remove the quake under the floorboards. Once a house becomes quiet in one unforgettable way, other houses hear it. The physician, his name was Eli Webb, kept a leather bag with more than instruments. He kept a journal in it, and in that journal he kept notes he would never publish. He wrote that Clara's mind worked like a weaver's hands. He wrote that patience can look like peace from the outside while it is building a staircase inside. He wrote about the curl in the G and how a habit in a letter can betray a person more quickly than a face. He wrote finally that some truths should be allowed to rest where the water took them. He did one more thing. He traveled north once, years later, long after people in Mississippi had stopped saying Clara's name out loud. He sat in a small schoolhouse where 2 young women taught children to read in a town that smelled like wood smoke and apples. Their names were Grace and Patience now, not the names other people had tried to give them. He watched the care in their hands and the way they looked at each other before answering hard questions. He told himself he had come to verify a fact. Instead, he found himself whispering a prayer without words and leaving without introductions. There is a story people tell about that letter he received after that trip, an envelope with no return. Inside, a pressed magnolia blossom, fragile and stubborn, that could only have come from far away. No words, just a scent that can pull a man through time in one breath. He burned the blossom and the envelope and kept the ash inside a jar toward the back of a shelf. Not all keepsakes want to be seen. Meanwhile, life kept teaching in quiet places. In a city that would one day rise from fire, an older woman who went by Martha Washington taught cooks to season with care and to measure with their eyes as much as their spoons. She wore gloves, even when the kitchen was hot. She tested every pot herself before any bowl left the stove. She did not speak of Mississippi, but Mississippi had taught her. People learned more than flavors from her. They learned how to move in a world that watched them with one eye open. Once, 2 young women visited her. They were polite, educated, and steady. They called her Mrs. Washington, and she did not let her hands shake when she poured the tea. They spoke about a school for children. They spoke about a hymn in a language most had never heard. They stayed 2 hours. The next morning, on the table where the tea had been, a small note said only, "We are well." That was enough. People in that city liked to tell a certain rumor on winter nights, that an elderly woman, dressed in plain colors, would leave small envelopes for families who had taken in those who needed a place to sleep and a plan to move on. Each envelope held the exact same amount. Not much, just enough. Enough to say, "Someone sees you." Enough to say, "Keep going." When asked about it, the woman smiled like someone who had already used up all her words in a different decade. Not every ending needs to be written in ink. Some endings prefer bread, or shoulders, or doors quietly left unlatched. Some endings choose to be the beginning of someone else's safety. Years pass quickly when you count them by harvests, and slowly when you count them by distance from a single night. The big house changed owners again. Its walls kept their secrets the way old trees hold lightning scars under new bark. The quarters held fewer voices, then different voices. Children skipped ropes to rhymes that made no sense to the people who had first sung them. One autumn, an envelope found its way to an editor who loved tidy stories. Inside lay a single page torn from a ledger discovered behind a boarding house walled during repairs. The page carried 4 words in a graceful hand. The letter G curled like a secret smile. "My daughters are free." The editor printed a short piece, careful to avoid names. People read it at breakfast and felt something behind their ribs loosen, even if they didn't know why. There is another story that sounds like fiction, but walks like memory. At a funeral in Chicago for a respected woman named Martha Washington, a visitor arrived who didn't look like she belonged to the neighborhood. Black veil, careful steps, a single magnolia blossom in her hand. She placed it on the coffin and left before anyone asked a question. A few old people whispered the name Emma after she was gone, as if a door had opened and closed in the same breath.
What really happened at the river? What really happened at that table? There are polite answers, and then there are answers that make rooms colder. Here is a simpler truth. A house once felt too sure of itself. A woman who had lost too much stood in a doorway and made a choice. The details will always be argued. The result will not. People learned that night that power is not only who eats first. Sometimes it is who understands what a path looks like in the dark. In the end, the most important part of the story isn't the supper. It's what grew out of it. Children learned to read under quilts and behind doors. Women learned to copy letters so well, the ink fooled men who believed no one was looking closely. Men learned to keep watch at windows without moving the curtains. Communities learned to breathe together, slow, calm, steady, until the storm passed and the next step could be taken without noise. If you listen closely in certain kitchens, you'll hear a saying passed down from a teacher who never signed her name on a chalkboard. The secret ingredient is always intention. In food, in plans, in love, in how you carry grief. Intention seasons everything. It can ruin a night. It can also build a life. One evening, a young woman knocked on the back door of the State Street boarding house that used to smell like onions and hope. She wore her hair like her mother had taught her and introduced herself with two names, one from her family, one for the world. She said she wanted to learn medicine, but would start in the kitchen. She said her mother had told her that a stove is a laboratory if you pay close enough attention. The woman who opened the door smiled and stepped aside. "Come in," she said. "We teach everything we know here." What would you have done in that dining room, hearing the clock grow loud? What would you have done at the river, fog curling around your ankles? Would you have stayed to lift the fallen, or walk toward the water and the chance to write a different future from the edges? There isn't one right answer. There is only your answer, and the way it changes you to speak it out loud. Remember this as you leave this story behind. A ledger once had the last word over a mother's arms. Years later, another ledger carried the line she wrote for herself, the line that mattered more than any charge or rumor or official remark. My daughters are free. Freedom is not neat, and it is not quiet. It is patient. It is stubborn. It is a river that keeps moving even when no one is looking. Before we end, carry one more picture with you. A night warm enough to open windows. A long table that once held a feast, and now holds nothing but candle stubs and the faint scent of magnolia. A kitchen where someone rinses a bowl and sets it on a towel to dry. The water looks ordinary, but the hands that lift that bowl know what it costs to build a life from almost nothing. The room is simple. The work is steady. The future is already sitting at the small table by the door, waiting for lessons to begin.